As American society adapted and changed through the Roaring Twenties, African American culture came of age and went mainstream. Seated in a background of slavery and prejudice, black music and art gave African Americans an identity. All of this led to the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a rebirth of African American culture during the 1920s. The revival was a cultural, social, and artistic explosion of African American identity, centered in Harlem, New York.
Do you remember the Great Migration? World War I brought about the Great Migration. African Americans left the South and moved to northern cities in droves. They filled factory jobs left vacant by men going to war. They also fled racial discrimination and agricultural servitude. During the war, every northern city saw a spike in African American population. This rebirth of African American culture begins with this Great Migration. Former slaves and poor southern blacks moved to northern cities during World War I. By 1920, 5 million African Americans, 40% of African Americans living in the United States, lived in these cities. They moved for cheap factory jobs and to escape the Jim Crow South. Still, racial tensions rose in cities between whites and blacks. Harlem, New York became the central capital for northern blacks. With a huge African American population, Harlem was the heart of this rebirth.
By embracing their new unified identity, African Americans also fought the fight for equality. By 1920, two distinctly different groups had formed in the area of civil rights. The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, sought equality among races through both legislation and militancy. James Weldon Johnson and W.E.B. Du Bois were both leaders in the civil rights movement of the 1920s. Both men preached inclusion of African Americans in white society, but also encouraged protest against discrimination.
The other side of the civil rights movement was led by Marcus Garvey, who founded the UNIA, or the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The UNIA focused on creating a separate black society. Garvey opened offices in poor ghettos to help poor blacks. Because he felt blacks and whites could not coexist, he created the Back to Africa movement, calling for blacks to unify from whites and create an all-black society in a resettled Africa.
The new black identity that was reborn in the Harlem Renaissance really blossomed in art and literature. Black writers and artists celebrated African American culture in their work. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes were the top writers of the time. Hughes's poems moved to a jazz tempo and defiantly spoke about black struggles. Hurston wrote emotional books about African Americans overcoming the Jim Crow South. Works like Langston Hughes' The Weary Blues and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God were some of the biggest titles that come out of the age and really inspired future African American artists.
But most of all, the Harlem Renaissance gave birth to the American art form, jazz. African American artists such as Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Louis Armstrong became the stars of the movement. These artists performed soulful songs about black life in clubs and gin joints. This movement became so popular that it began to break down racial barriers. White Americans flocked to black nightclubs to hear the new musical sensation jazz. The best example of this is New York City's Cotton Club. The Cotton Club was a whites-only establishment, even though it featured many of the most popular black entertainers of the era. The popularity of this club showed the appreciation that white America had for African American culture. The new identity and pride created by the Harlem Renaissance gave African Americans the confidence to go forward to begin to strive for equality.
For many white Americans, the Harlem Renaissance was the very first opportunity to get a look inside of African American culture. And this is the first step towards racial equality. It made us realize that perhaps we weren't so different after all. In the decades to come, the civil rights movement will strive for racial equality. But the Harlem Renaissance was the first step in that journey.